Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a response to serious allegations against a police department that doesn't immediately go the usual legal route, but instead involves a kind of spiritual offering.
Right.
That's the really intriguing situation we're diving into today with Ambassador Josiah Holtom's initiative. It concerns alleged constitutional improprieties within the city of Henderson Police Department.
It's definitely a fascinating approach, yeah. Tackling these, very serious legal concerns with what seems like a deeply personal, almost faith-based strategy.
Exactly. One of our listeners actually shared Ambassador Holtom's letter. It was sent to the Henderson City Clerks, dated Memorial Day, May 26th, 2025.
Okay.
And there was an analysis with it that really helps sort of shed light on the context. So our goal in this deep dive is to understand Ambassador Holtom's concerns, his, let's say, unusual proposed solution, and the background, especially the significance of that Memorial Day timing.
Well, choosing Memorial Day for this communication, that does add an interesting layer, doesn't it? It's a day we usually think about upholding national values, like the Constitution.
Absolutely. So, what exactly are Ambassador Haltom's core concerns here? The letter, it clearly states his belief in egregious constitutional violations supposedly committed by the Henderson Police Department.
Mm.
And look, this isn't just like speculation floating around. These allegations are reportedly part of an active case in the United States courts. Well, as of the date on that letter, anyway.
Okay, so that immediately signals these aren't just sort of vague claims, they're actually being addressed within the legal system already.
Right. But this is where the strategy takes a surprising turn. Instead of only focusing on those legal channels through Haltom Family Ministries, Ambassador Haltom is proposing something more spiritually focused.
Mm.
An intervention, maybe.
That shift, it suggests he might see the issues running deeper than just, isolated incidents of misconduct.
Exactly. His reasoning seems to point to this perception of really profound systemic problems. He talks about snaring forces of structural violence and even spiritual wickedness.
Wow, strong words.
Yeah, and he believes these forces are impacting not just the HPD, but also community corrections programs and the for profit prison industry. He specifically names Corrections Corporation of America, which we now know as Coors Civic.
So if you look at it broadly, he's suggesting these aren't just separate events, but symptoms of something kind of embedded much deeper in the system itself.
And his proposed way to tackle these deep seated issues is through the gift of light, these little pocket sized ZOHAR books from Kabbalah Center
Big
International.
ZOHAR, and specifically from that organization. Those are significant details. We probably need to dig into that more to really get the full picture here.
Agreed. But first, the stated intention behind this gift is basically to encourage positive change, spiritual upliftment, among the people involved in law enforcement operations there in Henderson. It's like a real step away from a purely legal fight towards something, well, pretty unconventional.
Yeah.
Now, how do you even present such a spiritually oriented idea to secular authorities while still emphasizing how serious the original legal claims are?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The drafted letter he sent, it gives us some clues.
It does. So the letter is addressed to Mr. Jim E. Garland. He holds two roles, city recorder and city court clerk for Henderson, and it's dated that Memorial Day, May 26, 2025. Sending it to him seems quite deliberate.
Absolutely. I mean, given his responsibilities for city records and the municipal court, Mr. Jarlin is right in the middle of the city's administration. Makes sense.
The letter starts by expressing Ambassador Holtom's profound and ongoing concern about those alleged constitutional violations by the HPD. It repeats his conviction that there are deeper issues extending to community corrections and core civic. Then, it introduces the plan, offering these pocket Zohar books, calls them a gift of light, and seeds of tikkun olam. That's a Hebrew phrase meaning the repair of the world.
Tikkun olam. That's a concept with a lot of history and, well, different interpretations. Definitely something we should unpack a bit more to really understand what he means by that here.
We definitely will. After laying that out, the letter gets practical. It asks for information on the number of every police person and those connected to the HPD operations so he can distribute these books. It's a very direct request, even if it's unusual.
Yeah.
By sending this to Mr. Garland, Ambassador Haltom is essentially looking for the city's cooperation, or at least their help with the logistics, right? Getting these books to the people he intends them for.
Precisely. As city recorder and city court clerk, Garland would likely know or have access to the city's organizational structure, the personnel lists, including what's connected to the HPD.
Exactly. So it didn't go straight to the police chief or the mayor, but to this key administrative figure. Now, to really get the context, it helps to know a bit more about Henderson itself, the city government. It operates with a mayor and a board of aldermen.
Standard structure for many cities that size.
Yeah. And we've mentioned Mr. Garland's important roles. The Henderson Police Department itself, the HPD, is led by Police Chief Gary Davidson. To get a clearer picture, what does the HPD actually say its mission is?
Well, looking at an organization's mission statement can often tell you about the ideals they aim for, at least on paper.
True. So, the HPD's mission statement talks about safeguarding lives and property, reducing crime and fear, enhancing public safety, standard stuff. But importantly, it also declares a dedication to honor and integrity and conducting themselves with the highest ethical standards to keep the public's trust.
And that contrast between this stated commitment to high ethical standards and Ambassador Haltom's allegations of, egregious constitutional violations, that's pretty stark. It really highlights the potential seriousness here.
It really does. Now, he also ropes community corrections into his view of systemic problems. For anyone listening who might not be totally familiar, these programs are generally alternatives to traditional jail time.
No. Yeah, they focus on things like rehabilitation, maybe substance abuse treatment, mental health support, helping people get back into the community, hopefully reducing reoffending.
So the idea behind community corrections is usually positive. Why might Ambassador Haltom see them as part of this structural violence then?
That's the critical question. His view seems to suggest a concern that maybe in practice, these programs aren't really achieving those rehabilitative goals. Perhaps they're too influenced by a more punitive mindset from the wider justice system, or maybe even, like he suggests, by the profit motives of the private prison industry.
Which brings us right back to CoreCivic, formerly CCA. They're a huge player in the private prison world.
A very big player, and one that's faced a lot of scrutiny.
Right. And CoreCivic has definitely faced, well, a significant amount of documented controversy over the years. We're talking allegations of mismanagement, really concerning conditions inside their facilities, both for inmates and staff, understaffing that leads to safety problems.
Instances of medical negligence, civil rights violations have been reported.
And significant lobbying efforts, too, which many critics believe actually push policies that lead to higher incarceration rates overall.
The analysis you mentioned, it gives some specific examples that really paint a picture of these controversies.
It does. There were major problems reported at their facility in Leavenworth, pretty disturbing descriptions of conditions there. They admitted falsifying staffing records over in Idaho. There have even been accusations of using forced labor in immigration detention centers.
So yeah, it's a company that's definitely drawn a lot of negative attention.
For sure. And while CoreCivic might not be directly running the Henderson Police Department or the local community corrections, their influence on the bigger justice system, maybe through lobbying or setting industry standards, that could be the kind of indirect connection Ambassador Haltom is pointing to when he talks about structural violence. That seems like a plausible way to interpret his concern, connecting those dots. So with that context now, let's dig into this gift of light. What is the ZOHAR exactly, and why is the link to Kabbalah Center International important here?
Good question. So the Zohar is basically a foundational text in Kabbalah, which is the mystical tradition within Judaism. It's not just one book, it's more like a collection of writings. It's got mystical commentaries on the Torah, interpretations of scripture, discussions about, the nature of God, the universe, mystical psychology.
Deep stuff.
Very deep stuff. And traditionally, it's been seen as highly complex, very esoteric, usually studied only by select scholars who are really immersed in Jewish law and thought. So probably not standard issue reading material for most folks, especially not police officers, right?
Not typically, no.
Yeah.
And this is where Kabbalah Center International, or KCI, enters the picture. Their whole mission is kind of about making Kabbalah teachings accessible to a wider audience for use in modern life, promoting positive global change, that sort of thing.
Okay.
And Michael Berg, he's the son of the center's founders, he produced an English translation of the Zohar that KCI promotes pretty heavily.
Right. So they're taking this traditionally very niche scholarly text and trying to make it mainstream almost.
Kind of, yeah. But what are some of the criticisms of that approach? The analysis mentions some pretty significant pushback.
Yes, there's been quite a bit of significant criticism, actually, both from academic scholars of Judaism and religion, and also from within more traditional rabbinic circles.
Like what?
Well, critics point to alleged inaccuracies in KCI's translations and interpretations. Some see a kind of New Age influence that they argue waters down the original spiritual depth. There's also criticism about a focus on materialistic benefits like getting wealthy or finding success, which some feel really misrepresents the core teachings of Kabbalah.
Okay, so it's not universally accepted as, let's say, a completely faithful representation of traditional Kabbalah.
Not at all. That's an important distinction. Critics also suggest KCI sometimes selectively edits passages or presents concepts that are traditionally understood within a specifically Jewish context as being more universal, stripping some of that context away.
Interesting. And their take on tikkun olam, that repairing the world idea, that's also drawn fire. How so?
Well, traditionally in rabbinic thought, tikkun olam often meant concrete actions, legal, ethical things aimed at improving society, making things more just.
Hmm.
Later, in some Kabbalistic traditions, especially Lurianic Kabbalah from the 16th century, it took on this more cosmic meaning. It involved human actions like prayer and observing the mitzvah, the commandments, as ways to help mend a kind of primordial spiritual shattering of the divine sparks.
Okay, so very specific theological idea.
Exactly. Critics argue that KCI's approach kind of detaches Tikkun Olam from those historical and theological roots. They say KCI emphasizes more individual shifts in consciousness, connecting with the Zohar's energy, whatever that means, and
Yeah.
some critics allege financial support for the center itself rather than traditional Jewish practice or communal responsibility.
Okay. So offering these specific KCI interpreted Zohar books as a spiritual fix for alleged constitutional violations. Well, that could be seen in a lot of different ways, couldn't it?
Yep.
And many of those ways might not really line up with the complex history and theology we just touched on. For secular officials, working within a legal system, the connection between this esoteric text from a somewhat controversial religious group and concrete allegations of police misconduct could seem, well, pretty jarring, disconnected.
There's a real risk, isn't there? That the sort of symbolic, maybe even strange nature of the gift could completely overshadow the actual seriousness of the constitutional concerns he's raising.
Exactly. It's a bold move. Very unconventional, to say the least. Let's think about the practical side for a second. How would the logistics even work? Getting these books to every police person and those connected to the HPD operations.
Well, the letter asks Mr. Garland for a number, right? An estimate of how many people that is. That's step one.
Okay.
But then, yeah, how do they get distributed? Would the city officials actually help? Would HPD leadership get involved? And what kind of reactions could they even expect from the city officials themselves?
I imagine a formal acknowledgement of the letter is probable. But behind closed doors, there could be a lot of confusion, maybe skepticism.
I think a huge concern for the city's lawyers would be the separation of church and state, the Establishment Clause.
Good point.
City legal counsel would likely advise against any direct city or police department involvement in handing out materials that could be seen as religious. They might just politely decline to help with distribution at all.
That seems like a very real possibility, yeah. What about the cops themselves, the HPD personnel? How might they react?
Oh, reactions among the officers and staff would probably be all over the map. Everything from, mild curiosity to maybe suspicion, discomfort, maybe even feeling offended.
Yeah, I could see that.
Some might interpret the whole gesture, especially with that language about spiritual wickedness, as a direct criticism of them, their ethics, their job.
Mm-hmm.
And if the distribution felt forced in any way or even endorsed by leadership, you could definitely see police unions potentially objecting.
It really highlights how crucial the framing of this whole initiative would be. It would
Big
need to
time.
be presented very, very carefully, like maybe as a totally voluntary, benevolent thing aimed at personal growth, not as a judgment or some kind of directive.
Absolutely. And there's also that big risk we mentioned if the media picks up on this.
Oh, yeah.
The focus could easily become all about the novelty, the weirdness of the spiritual gift itself, instead of the underlying, potentially very serious allegations of constitutional violations. The headline writes itself, right? Police offered mystical books, not concerns raised about police conduct.
That's a really good point. So wrapping this section up, Ambassador Haltom's initiative is, well, it's certainly complex. He's trying to bridge this gap between significant legal concerns and a spiritual approach. offering a text from a specific and, as we've heard, somewhat debated religious tradition.
And his reasoning seems to be targeting what he sees as these deeper systemic issues infecting law enforcement and related systems.
What's really fascinating here is seeing these two very different worlds collide almost. You've got this secular legal framework, constitutional rights, accountability, courts,
And then you have the personal, spiritual realm of faith, interchange, repairing the world through, well, in this case, specific mystical texts.
and the act of offering these KCI Zohar books as the response, it's undeniably unique. And it carries, like you said, a lot of uncertainty about how it will be received and what impact, if any, it will actually have on the core issues.
Which leads us to a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to mull over. Given that constitutional separation of church and state, how are unconventional, maybe spiritually motivated approaches to fixing systemic secular problems likely to be seen by people in power?
Yeah. What are the potential consequences, both the intended ones and the unintended ones, when personal faith intersects so directly with things like legal accountability and the overall well being of a community?
It presents a really complex dynamic, doesn't it? Lots to think about there.
It certainly does. We hope you'll reflect on this intersection: spiritual beliefs, legal accountability, community health. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us today.